In this lecture, I will discuss the Late Kingdom and the rocky road that Egypt had to navigate in an increasingly dangerous world of powerful empires that rose up to compete in swallowing up the entire Middle East. Egypt will be forced to face its own diminishing role in that world and suffer the indignity of being a vassal state to powers that were much greater than herself, and who only saw her as a source of tribute and rich harvests. I will talk about a little-known era when Egypt was ruled for about 100 years by Nubian rulers, who sought to restore her to her glory years, but were repeatedly beaten into submission by the hammer of Assyria. Then Egypt will experience a very brief renewal before barely escaping the yoke of Babylon. But that was only a brief respite before she was crushed by the might of the Persian Empire. Then an unexpected savior will appear on the horizon from the distant mountains of Macedonia to the north of Greece, Alexander the Great, who freed them from the grasp of Persia and made himself pharaoh for a time. So we'll talk about the coming of Hellenism and of the Ptolemaic era in our last lecture on Egypt. Well, we have arrived at last to the Late Kingdom era before we get to the Ptolemaic era here for our last lecture on Egypt. This Late Kingdom really does represent the end of an era. And it ends, interestingly enough, with Egypt being ruled by a series of rulers from south of Egypt, from an area that Egypt had always dominated, the land of Kush or Nubia, or basically for today, the Sudan. So we're going to have a series of Nubian rulers, and I say this is unexpected because Nubia had always been completely dominated by Egypt and had been the source of much of Egypt's gold. But now the Nubians are going to turn the tables, and they will become rulers of Egypt in establishing the 25th dynasty from 721 to 656 BC approximately, so about 150 years or so. Now, rich in gold, Nubia had always been controlled and pillaged by Egypt for nearly 1,000 years. Then the Nubian king Kushite invaded Upper Egypt in 756 BC, gaining control of Thebes. Now, he was able to do this because, as we've talked about before, Egypt is in a period of decline, and so not as strong as it had been before. But he doesn't control all of Egypt, so he's not pharaoh at this point. He invades Upper Egypt and he gains control of the capital city. But then his successor, Pia, then continues this policy by gathering up his armies and defeating a coalition of 4 Egyptian rulers and founded the 25th dynasty in 721 BC. Now, 721 might be familiar to those of you who remember from biblical history. 721 is when the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in Palestine and took the 10 tribes of Israel captive and scattered them to the winds. So here we see Pia in Egypt. He's defeating a coalition of 4 Egyptian rulers and founds the 25th dynasty. He then returns to Nubia, where he died and was buried in, of all things, a pyramid. So with Pia, we get the revival of pyramid building. So here's an example of Nubian pyramids. They're obviously built on the same design standard, the same principle as Egyptian pyramids, but completely different profile by having a much steeper angle to the pyramid, and they're much smaller as well. So these are the types of pyramids that show up in Nubia. Now here's a wider view to give you an idea of some ruined pyramids in the background, and then some reconstructed ones up here in the foreground. They could be anywhere from 20 feet to 90 feet high, so not particularly large in terms of their overall scale, especially compared to Egyptian pyramids. And they do have a rather strange addition here in that they seem to be kind of a combination of a burial structure and a religious pylon temple structure. So you've got the pyramid, inside of which is a burial chamber, and then a small pylon gate attached to the front of it. Kind of an interesting interpretation, needless to say. Here's an example of the scale of one of the smaller ones, so you can see that they're not particularly large. Now, interestingly enough, there are twice as many pyramids in Nubia, at least, twice as many as there are in Egypt, so pyramid building in Nubia became very popular for a period of time. So during this 25th dynasty, we're going to see 4 Nubian rulers within a 100-year period approximately. Here is an image of Shabaka, who confirmed Nubian control over the entire Nile. And this is going to be about 710. So with his military force, he reaffirms Pia's conquests over the entire Nile Valley. He will establish his capital at Memphis instead of Thebes. And also, interestingly enough, he will make the effort to restore Egyptian monuments. Now, this is necessary because over the centuries, with all the decline and the troubles that Egypt was going through and the weakened pharaohs and so on, the monuments apparently had gone into a certain degree of decline, and so Shabaka attempts to restore those monuments to their original state. Now, just to remind you, Assyria had begun its expansion in the Mesopotamian River Valley in 911 BC, so a couple of hundred years prior to this. And then Assyria had invaded, I say Judea here, but it wasn't Judea in those days. It would have been Palestine in 721 and took the capital city of Samaria and deported the 10 tribes of Israel to the 4 winds. 10 lost tribes, in other words. Now, Shabaka, seeing that Assyria was beginning to expand southward after having conquered the Mesopotamian valley, began to move into the Levant and was moving southward toward Egypt. And of course, Shabaka did not want to have to fight Assyria, whose reputation as an unbeatable force was overwhelming. So Shabaka makes a very unwise decision to support an Israelite rebellion against Assyria at Ashdod, Ashdod being a city in Palestine. But both the Israelites and Shabaka's Egyptian force were defeated. Now, Egypt supported Israel as a buffer to the Assyrians because it wanted to slow down the advance of the Assyrians on Egypt if that was their goal, which it appeared to be. So then his successor, Shebitku, 707 to 690, he also tried to aid Israel against Assyria, but also failed. Then his successor, Taharka, 690 to 664, he was able to reign over what for a while was a prospering Egypt. Assyria had not yet arrived in the south, but was always a looming presence in the northern Levant. So even though Egypt was in a brief era of prosperity, Taharka also got into trouble with the Assyrians. Just to recap what Assyria is doing. So here we see in this beautiful Assyrian relief a depiction of the Assyrian emperor in his war chariot participating in one of his favorite activities, which was lion hunting. Now the Assyrians were a very militant-minded sort of people. So here is their empire as it existed about this period of time in Mesopotamia and down the Levant as far as Kingdom of Judah. Now, the ruler of Judah at that time was a king by the name of Hezekiah. So even though Judah was not yet devoured by the Assyrian Empire, they nevertheless owed tribute to Assyria. And it was King Hezekiah who decided to quit paying that tribute. And so he rebelled against Assyrian control by refusing to continue to send annual tribute. So by that time we've got a king in Assyria, or an emperor, by the name of Sennacherib. So he decides to bring Judah to heel. So he invades Palestine and captured all of the great cities except for Jerusalem. At this point, Tarka foolishly offers to aid Hezekiah. Again, he's backing the wrong horse here, so he's simply trying to forestall the inevitable, it seems. But in any case, he offers to aid Hezekiah by bringing his forces against Sennacherib. This is a verse from the Bible that deals with this period. And it says, "And when Sennacherib heard say of Tirhakah," that was the way that the Hebrews spelled Taharka, king of Ethiopia or Nubia, "when he heard say of Tirhakah, behold, he is come out to fight against you, he sent a message unto Hezekiah, saying, Let not your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying, Jerusalem shall not be delivered into my hand. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, destroying them utterly. And do you think that you will not be delivered?" Well, this frightened Hezekiah to the point where he submitted to Sennacherib and sent him some tribute. And so Sennacherib was at the time besieging the Judean city of Lachish. And so according to the scriptures again, the Old Testament, it says, "And Hezekiah sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, quote, I have offended thee. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear." Close quote. And the king of Assyria demanded from Hezekiah 300 talents of silver. Now, a talent is a certain measure of weight that was used commonly in the ancient world. It's difficult to know exactly how much a talent weighed, but in some sources it's claimed to be about 72 pounds. So 300 talents of silver. So if you calculate the total weight of silver here based on that value, and then you equate it to today's monetary values, that would be in the neighborhood of a little over $1.5 million worth of silver. So he demanded from Hezekiah 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Now, gold was much more precious than silver was, and so 30 talents of it equates in today's monetary system to a little over $1 billion. Okay? So Hezekiah is strapped for cash here. He needs to give Sennacherib this tremendous amount of money in tribute. So Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord, the temple, and the treasures of the palace. And he did cut off the gold from the doors and pillars of the temple, and he gave it all to the king of Assyria. Well, turns out that Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem anyway. However, he did spare the city by being bought off with more tribute, and then he returned to Assyria for a while. Now, it's interesting that we have both an Assyrian version of this episode and a Judean version of the episode. When Sennacherib returned to Nineveh, he had his scribes write down what had happened with the siege of Jerusalem, and this is what the Assyrians say. "As to Hezekiah, he did not submit to my yoke, so I made him a prisoner in Jerusalem, like a bird in a cage. I then increased the tribute to me as overlord, which I imposed upon him beyond the former tribute, to be delivered annually. Hezekiah himself did send me, together with 2 tons of gold and 30 tons of silver, precious stones, couches inlaid with ivory, and all kinds of valuable treasure, his own daughters and concubines." Well, now here is the Hebrew version from the Bible. "And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses." Okay, so, and then the scriptures go on to say that now the Assyrian army then retreats after that disaster. The Assyrian army now retreats back to Assyria. Well, it's interesting to compare the two versions here of the same event. And you have to make up your mind as to which one you believe to be the more factual. As far as the Jews were concerned, it was the angel of the Lord that saved them from being conquered by the Assyrians. As far as the Assyrians were concerned, it was the tribute that Hezekiah offered. Anyway, kind of interesting to compare the two. In any case, whatever happened there, of course, with 185,000 dead, I'm not sure there'd be any soldiers in the Assyrian army left, but nevertheless. Assyria returned 20 years later under another emperor by the name of Ashurbanipal, because he was intent on invading Egypt. Okay, so he swept right on past Jerusalem and on down into Egypt, where he defeated Taharka. And this was in 667 BC. Now, following that defeat, Taharka can see the writing on the wall, so to speak, and he flees to Nubia, back home, leaving the Assyrians in total control of Egypt. So here we see the map now of the Assyrian Empire, all of Mesopotamia, all of the Levant, and all the way down to Thebes. So Assyrian troops did take control of Thebes and sacked this capital city, which never fully recovered throughout the rest of Egyptian history. Ashurbanipal then executed nearly all Egyptian nobles with the exception of one, a fellow by the name of Necho. Now, the Assyrians didn't want to establish an Assyrian ruler in Egypt, and so instead they selected a native Egyptian to become their puppet king, so to speak. So Necho I was installed as a puppet king in 666 BC. So this will lead to a new dynasty called the Saite dynasty. So Necho dies, and a fellow that takes the name of Psamtik I succeeds him, and he will rule from the delta in a city called Sais, from which we get the Saite dynasty. So 664 BC, and so here is his official pharaonic portrait. Now, it's interesting that Necho will try to regain their independence or freedom from Assyria. So he increases the size of the army, apparently when the Assyrians weren't really looking, by hiring Greek mercenaries. And he was able to drive the Assyrians from Egypt, largely because they were probably distracted by the growing power of Babylon in their backyard and weren't paying that much attention to what the Egyptians were doing. Now, with Egypt under full Egyptian control, once again, under Necho, an archaizing period became popular. Now, by archaizing, what we mean is reverting back to old styles of things in kind of a nostalgic sort of manner. So this is a nostalgic revival of styles of the Old Kingdom in terms of architecture, in terms of art styles. I'm not sure exactly because I don't really have a lot of identifiable remains from this period. Nevertheless, what I want to do, because we don't have a lot to look at here, what I want to do is to show you how we have also gone through this archaizing period in our own Western culture. So here's our own version of that. Now these images are of buildings that you probably all recognize. So we've got the Paris Opera House in a Baroque style. We've got Houses of Parliament in a Gothic style of architecture. We've got Neuschwanstein in Bavaria in a medieval architectural style. We've got the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. in a Roman classical style. We've got the Carson House in California in a Victorian style. We've got in Salt Lake City the LDS Temple in a Gothic and Romanesque combination style. And then also from Salt Lake, we've got the county building here in a decidedly Romanesque style. Now, the reason I show you all of these is because all of them, despite their style, was built in the 19th century. So why didn't we build a modern building in the 19th century for the Capitol building or for Houses of Parliament or for the Opera House? Why did the architects reach back into our past to revive these styles? Well, it's our own romantic nostalgia for the past, our own archaizing era, so to speak. And so I can imagine that the Egyptians are doing the same kind of thing with their architecture under Necho. So what this does is make a symbolic connection with the past, because there's something about the past that we value. All right, so now his son, Necho II, is a rather adventuresome and ambitious sort of individual, interestingly enough. Remember, Egypt is independent during this period of time. It's free from any kind of outside control during this time. And so Necho II, strangely enough or interestingly enough, begins digging a canal from the Nile to the Red Sea. Now we're all familiar with the Suez Canal today that creates a connection between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Well, Necho tried his own version of that by digging a canal from the Nile River here in the Delta across the desert to the head of the Red Sea. The purpose, of course, is to facilitate trade up and down the east coast of Africa. Never finishes it, however, although you can find evidence of that canal still present in the desert east of Egypt. Now also, even more interesting is that he possibly, according to the Greeks, Necho II sent a 3-year expedition, seaborne expedition, down the Red Sea and around Africa, circumnavigating Africa and back to the mouth of the Nile River. And I show you this recreation of an Egyptian boat to give you an idea of the kind of ship that perhaps they sailed in. Now this is really unexpected and perhaps even improbable because, as we've talked about, the Egyptians were not seafaring people. So to send an expedition around Africa, it's almost beggars the imagination. And so they followed a path, probably something like that. Took them 3 years, according to the chronicler, to get all the way back to the Delta again, the mouth of the Nile. Now, how could they do that? Well, arguably the Egyptians couldn't have done it by themselves. But it is believed that Necho II engaged or commissioned Phoenicians to man the ship. And of course, the Phoenicians are Phoenicia, which is a seaport here in the Levant, and were renowned sailors. And so the ship was probably manned by Phoenicians, along with some representatives of Egypt along for the ride. Okay? So the voyage is not verified, not confirmed, but there are reports that Necho commissioned such an extravagant voyage of exploration. If so, remarkable. Okay, then it was Babylon's turn to take their swipe at Egypt. So here let's just take a look at Babylon here for a moment. Now remember, Assyria had returned to Mesopotamia from its occupation of Egypt in order to defend itself from Babylon, because Babylon was a growing power in Mesopotamia and eventually swept aside the Assyrians and basically replaced the Assyrians in terms of its empire. So here we see a model of the city of Babylon. Now, Babylon invaded Palestine in 609 BC. Okay. Now, Necho II campaigned in Palestine against the Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar. Now, this was, again, rather foolish for Necho to think that he could somehow prevent the Babylonians from coming into Egypt any more than his predecessors were able to prevent the Assyrians from doing so. Nevertheless, he mounts a campaign, gathers together his forces, and moves into Palestine in order to confront the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar in Palestine. Now, this is kind of an interesting episode, and it's kind of hard to understand what's going on here exactly, but the king of Judah at that time was a fellow by the name of Josiah. So King Josiah. Now, the thing that's interesting here is that instead of allying himself with Necho and the Egyptians, he instead allies himself with the Babylonians. And he refuses passage through Judah to the Egyptians. Now, it begs the question of why would Josiah do that? And obviously, Judah seems to be the next peg on the table to be in the path of the Babylonians. Well, perhaps Josiah, by allying himself with the Babylonians, thought that perhaps they'd give him a pass and simply become an ally and give them privileges, perhaps as an allied kingdom. In any case, King Josiah refuses passage to the Egyptians. Now, ultimately, in the confrontation between the Jews and the Egyptians, King Josiah is killed by an Egyptian arrow, and the Israelite army was eventually defeated by the Egyptians. So this is what it says in the Old Testament. After all this, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Nebuchadnezzar, and Josiah went out against him. But Necho sent ambassadors to him, saying, "What have I to do with you, king of Judah? I come not against you this day, but against the nation wherewith I have war, which is Babylon." Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself that he might fight with him, and hearkened not unto the words of Necho, and came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. So there's Megiddo again. And the archers, Egyptian archers, shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am sore wounded." His servants therefore took him and brought him to Jerusalem, and he died and was buried in one of the sepulchres of his fathers. So that's recounted in Chronicles. All right, so the Babylonians go on and defeat Necho and his Egyptian force, and Necho flees back to Egypt for safety. Now the Babylonians, interestingly enough, then betray the Jews, they turn on the Jews, and end up sacking Jerusalem. And this is the famous episode of when the Babylonians take the most important Jews captive after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Temple of Solomon. The Babylonians will take the Jews captive and force them to migrate to Babylonian territory, which is referred to as the Babylonian captivity. And so here we see a Babylonian relief of Jews with their baggage marching off to Babylon, being watched over by a Babylonian overseer here. So the Babylonian captivity, just one brief comment about that. Some of the most poignant or touching verses in all the Old Testament come out of this captivity. And this is the verses. "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hung our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that tormented us required us songs of joy, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. But how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her skill. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy." So these are verses out of Psalms, and I find them quite touching and beautiful in expressing the emotion, the sentiment of the Jews as they have been forced to migrate into Babylonia and settled in Babylonian territory on one of the rivers there. All right, well, as it turns out, the Babylonians ended up turning around and, for whatever reason, going back to Babylon. They didn't end up invading Egypt anyway. But 75 years later, Babylon herself will fall to a new rising power in the Middle East, and that's the Persians under King Cyrus. So this will be 539. So now Persia becomes the big dog on the block. So here we see a Persian relief of colored glazed tiles of their soldiers marching off to battle. Now the Persians under King Cambyses II did invade Egypt in 525. Psamtik III, the son of Necho II, was routed in a battle with them in the Delta in that same year. It's interesting to note that Cambyses went on to kill the Apis bull after the defeat of the Egyptians, kind of mocking the Egyptians for worshiping or venerating an animal. In any case, Cambyses was succeeded by a Persian by the name of Darius I. And some of you might recognize Darius I as the Persian emperor who sent an invasion of Greece in order to punish the Greeks for interfering in Persian affairs at one point, and had the infamous episode at Marathon in which the Athenians decisively defeated the Persian invasion and sent them scampering back home. And then Darius I was succeeded by his son Xerxes, who also invaded, if you'll remember, invaded Greece, and was held up at the famous pass of Thermopylae for 3 days by the Spartans before advancing on Athens and destroying the city of Athens. In any case, Xerxes took over control, and he was forced to quell continuous Egyptian revolts over the next 20 years. So the Egyptians did not enjoy being subjected to the Persians, needless to say, and revolted over and over again over the next 2 decades. Then finally, Artaxerxes, somebody of no great fame, finally got tired of that and withdrew his troops, and Egypt was briefly free again. So this is when the last native Egyptian pharaoh will come to the throne. His name is Nectanebo II, 360 to 343. So his most interesting accomplishment, as far as we're concerned, is that he built a temple called the Philae Temple. And here you see an image of it taken from a boat on the Nile River, because this has become a very famous tourist attraction. Beautifully picturesque building. Here we see one of the shrines located right next to the temple. I'll show you an aerial view in just a moment, where you can see this rather interestingly designed, unique type of maybe almost Baroque style of Egyptian architecture. But this is a rather interesting photograph here of Philae Temple being flooded. Okay, so like Abu Simbel, Philae Temple also had to be rescued from flooding. But this was by the lower Aswan Dam, and it was done in the 1970s. But as you can see, the lower Aswan Dam, the water had risen enough that it threatened Philae Temple. And so it was removed block by block and transferred to this island. So this island in the middle of the river now contains the Pylon Temple and this shrine. You can see the tourist boats gathered around here because, as I say, popular tourist attraction because of its picturesque nature. All right, so it's during the reign of Nectanebo II that the Persians returned to Egypt. They didn't want to give up that rich tribute and that rich resources of Egypt, and so they returned to Egypt and defeated him. And he fled to Nubia and died there, the last native Egyptian pharaoh. Well, the Persians go on to run Egypt as an absentee landlord. In other words, they didn't want to occupy the country. They didn't want to really send any Persian troops there to garrison the place or whatever. They pretty much ran it as absentee landlords, extracting as much wealth as possible under their governors, but never interested in occupying the country. Then we get the final Persian emperor, whose name is Darius III. Now, some of you might recognize his name as well, because his career ends in a rather ignominious way with a young man from the area of Greece by the name of Alexander the Great. So this is when Alexander the Great puts an appearance upon the world stage by invading Persia, defeating the Persian emperor and the Persian army, and taking over the Persian Empire through a series of conquests that we will talk about next class period. So, Alexander the Great, we'll talk about his career, how he interacts with Egypt, and the consequence of this period of time, which is referred to as the Hellenistic era in general artistic and historical terms, but will become known in Egypt as the Ptolemaic era, and that will be our last era of Egypt. So I'll see you then.